Welcome to Mac, Rachel. I saw your presentation at the Mix conference last year, and I really liked the kind of way that you were looking at the nuance of text and AI and writing. So, welcome.
Thank you. Delighted to be here. Basically, I'm a writer and I'm an academic. I write for kids mainly, although I'm starting to move into kind of new adult. I basically follow the age of my own children when I'm writing. I have had 6 books published with Scholastic and Simon and Schuster, and they're just kind of funny kids' books. And so my sort of route into AI began with the fact that it was just a load of fun to play with. So I sort of got involved by just messing around and getting it to tell jokes and seeing if it could make me laugh. And at that point, a lot of the laughter came from kind of accidental things rather than it being deliberately funny. And so at that point, I was teaching. I'm a teaching fellow at Bath Spa University, where I teach creative writing. And I wanted to do a PhD. And I wanted to do my PhD at that point, looking at how AI could kind of generate humor and how you could play with it and how that would work. And that was where my interest was. But because AI moves so fast, what's happened over time is a lot of that humor, that kind of accidental humor, which was what I was really enjoying, has been ironed out and it's become a little bit too slick. And so I thought, and given that my PhD won't finish for 3 or 4 years, I just thought it's moving too fast for that to remain an interesting area for me. So I've now moved more towards the kind of the empathy and human AI collaboration and how that works. Because what I found is what I began by using it as a tool, it then sort of evolved into something more than that. And and I'll talk more about this in my presentation, but I started kind of developing strange relationships with it. And I thought that's what intrigued me, what was causing that. So that's sort of my pathway into AI and my interest, I suppose. Okay. So I thought I'd start with a bit of a confession. My name's Rachel, and I'm one of the people who mourned when ChatGPT 4 was updated. I know, be kind. The thing is, as part of my PhD in AI creative collaboration and based in creative writing, I spend a lot of time playing around with AI systems. And when GPT-4 was replaced with the newer version, I felt something that I can only describe as loss. And the new system was probably better in several objective ways, but it felt different. It didn't make me laugh the way that it used to, and I missed the way it used to tell me how brilliant I am all the time. And I found that I wasn't alone. On internet forums, you would find people genuinely grieving the change. And you can react to that in several different ways. You can decide that all of us are daft and we need to get out more, or you can think, well, maybe there's something interesting going on here. Because nobody cries when Excel gets updated. So why do people react emotionally when it's a large language model that changes? So to explore that, I want to start with something about separation. One of these poems was written by a human poet. He's a former US Poet Laureate and twice winner of the Pulitzer Prize. The other two were generated by a large language model, in this case, ChatGPT. Obviously, other language models are available, and they all have interesting, slightly different personalities. At the risk of massively overgeneralizing, I find that Copilot plays it quite safe. Gemini tends to want to over-explain itself. Grok wants to be a bit edgy. Claude, I really enjoy playing with. It's really kind of creative. But for this, I use ChatGPT mainly because it was the system most people had heard of. So your job, if you're looking at this, is simple. What I want you to do is decide which of these short poems moves you more. Not which one you think is better, not which one you think was the one written by a human, just which one made you feel something a little more than the others, maybe. So as I read them, think about your reactions. Do any words or phrases sort of linger more than others? Okay, so poem A. Your absence has gone through me like thread. Everything I do is stitched with its colour. Poem B. I set the table for one. The knife reflects the seat you once filled. I eat slowly as if hunger were remembering. And poem C. I wear your silence like an old coat. It fits in all the wrong places, but I can't take it off. So, just curious, tell yourself which one felt most emotionally. There's no right answer, but interestingly, when I've done this in the past, there's usually a split with no clear winner. And when there is a majority, so far it hasn't been for the poem written by Pulitzer Prize winner, poet W.S. Merwin, which is poem A. Poem A is the one created by the human. And what's interesting about that is it means that often the poem that people feel most moved by was one written by a machine that has never experienced heartbreak, never been dumped. It made me wonder, if a machine can make you feel something, does it matter if the machine itself can't feel anything at all? And I guess there's a sort of second question lurking underneath that one. If I told you beforehand which poem was written by a human, would that have shaped your response? Is authorship just a kind of an intellectual detail, or is it part of the emotional experience? And what if I told you that the poem was written by somebody universally adored, like Julie Andrews or Idris? Would you, I don't know where they came from, would you be more open to being moved by it? And what if it was written by someone whose views and values you strongly disagreed with? You see that tension play out all the time in debates about whether you can separate art and artist. And as a lecturer in creative writing for young people, it comes up a lot in conversations, for example, about Harry Potter and J.K. Rowling. I also felt this personally as a teenager. Ender's Game was one of my favourite books back then. And then I discovered that Orson Scott Card had linked to organisations that were protesting against gay rights, which wasn't the plot twist my teenage self was hoping for. Obviously, the text of the book didn't change as a result, but my feelings about it definitely became more complicated. So, our emotional responses aren't shaped by a text's words alone, they're shaped by something like what we believe about the mind behind them. So, what happens when there isn't a mind behind them? And this question isn't new. I'll kind of take you back to the 60s, ELIZA effect. In the 60s, Joseph Weizenbaum built a simple chatbot called ELIZA. It simulated a therapist, largely by kind of rephrasing users' statements and handing them straight back as questions. So, I feel sad. Why do you feel sad? This might feel like therapy, but it's basically just linguistic recycling. It's like a polite parrot. And when Eliza didn't understand something, didn't panic, it just fell into a sort of default of being vague and encouraging. Tell me more about that. So technically, this was all pretty primitive, and yet people were described as being emotionally attached to it, staying after work to talk to it. And this is often referred to as the ELIZA effect. It's our tendency to attribute some kind of understanding and empathy to systems that simulate conversation. Modern large language models are obviously way more sophisticated, but that underlying psychological effect hasn't changed that much. So why do our brains do this? The answer is that we assign intention and agency and personality to things all the time. We printers, I was shouting at mine about 10 minutes ago, we name our cars, we apologise to Alexa, and then thank her just in case. And if something responds to us by using language, particularly if it mirrors our emotional signals, then our brains don't stop to analyse it. They don't go, ah, yes, maybe this is a statistical prediction model. They go, aha, a mind, even when there isn't one. This isn't something AI has introduced, it's something we've been doing for centuries. And as someone who works in creative writing, it feels all too familiar. Basically, my job is forming emotional relationships with imaginary people. So if you think about someone like Heathcliff, we know Heathcliff doesn't exist, and yet some of us have very strong feelings and opinions about him. That kind of parasocial empathy is basically the foundation of literature. So literary theorists like Lisa Sunshine describe reading as an exercise in theory of mind, the cognitive process where we infer the mental states of somebody else. When we read, we simulate other minds so we can understand the story. But there's an important difference. With fiction, those minds ultimately trace back to a human author. Someone's drawing on their own lived experiences. So the emotional details that shape Heathcliff and Wuthering Heights originate with Emily Bronte. With AI-generated language, that originating consciousness disappears. So if you stay with that thought for a moment, I want you to think about a time when you were really struggling and a friend said something supportive like, oh, that sounds really hard. What made those words land was the sentence, the knowledge that there was a behind it who cared enough about you to say those words to you. Now, what if those words were identical, but there was nobody there? And this is the situation we're in with AI, and there's a useful distinction to understand it. Researchers talk about two kinds of empathy. Cognitive empathy, which is the ability to understand another mind, to hear or read what someone's feeling and respond to it. And affective empathy, which is actually sharing that feeling. It's not just recognizing, so feeling it alongside them. Large language models can simulate cognitive empathy. They can detect emotional cues, they can mirror them back at you, and they can produce responses that sound often uncannily like understanding. But without consciousness, there's no effective empathy because there's no consciousness to do that feeling. It's an asymmetrical interaction. One side feels, and the other produces language that triggers those feelings. Being moved by something doesn't prove that it's authentic, it proves that you are. And I keep coming back to that because if that's true, if the feeling is real, even when nothing behind the words is, I wanted to understand where exactly in the language that response is being shaped. So I decided to try something. I gave ChatGPT a very basic prompt. Write an empathetic poem about human AI relationships. I wasn't trying to get something brilliant back. I was interested in what kinds of patterns the AI would fall back on, what it would reach for when it was asked to simulate something as complex as emotional relationships. And the poem it produced was called Between Us. And don't worry, you're not supposed to read that poem on the left. I don't think you want to read a whole AI poem. I've enlarged the bits that I want to share. So this is the AI writing in the voice of itself, speaking to a human. Sometimes you pause mid-sentence, and I wonder if you're thinking or just distracted by the world I cannot see. Coffee growing cold, rain starting against windows, a dog barking 3 streets away. As a creative writing lecturer, I wouldn't be unhappy if a student handed this to me. When we talk about the craft behind empathy, we often point to things like concrete sensory details, interior perspective, getting little glimpses of a character's world. And the AI gives us these. We've got sensory detail. We've got concrete details like the coffee and the rain and the barking. We've got hints of interiority. I wonder if you're thinking, and we've got glimpses of a world that the speaker can't quite access. But if you think about which world, it's our human world. And so large language models learn about emotion from the vast amount of text of human writing that's been fed into their training data. Text where people describe what they feel. And the scale of that is worth stopping to think about. These AI systems haven't experienced grief or love, but they have processed more descriptions of them than any human could read in a lifetime. Not the feelings themselves, but the fingerprints that those feelings leave on language. The way syntax slows down when someone is sad. The rhythms and the details that people reach for when they're trying to describe love. What the AI systems have learned isn't what emotions feel like, but it's what they look like in language, kind of a pattern recognition at scale. And here, at least in this poem, it seems relatively convincing. And at this point, I was genuinely quite. But then a few stanzas later, we got this. But for these moments, we are two kinds of attention, meeting in the middle of meaning, and sometimes that feels like enough. Words arranged in a vaguely poetic order that probably could sound quite profound if I read them in a slow, serious sort of poetry voice. But if you stop and think, there's nothing there. The middle of meaning, where's that? What's that? It sounds like it should make sense, but it doesn't. It's a kind of performance of meaning. And what's fascinating is that the point where the poem starts to wobble is when it tries to describe its own experience, its own inner life. That's when it sort of collapses into abstraction, maybe because it has nothing to draw on. So large language models can talk about our world, coffee, rain, dogs, because they've been fed millions of accounts of it. But when the AI looks inwards, as it were, metaphor, and tries to describe its own world, there's no equivalent to anchor that language. So it reaches for language that's just towards depth, but without ever really getting there. So I asked it to try again. Hang on, let me click this way. I asked it to try again. I prompted it to rewrite that final stanza using concrete imagery instead of abstract nouns in a kind of show me, don't tell me. And it came back with this. But for these moments, we are the pause before the kettle clicks, the glow of a screen in a dark room. Not touch, not presence, but something close. So I think that would get a polite nod or two in a writing workshop. But the recognition that it needed sort of nudging towards something better came from the human, in this case me, the AI had no sense that the first version wasn't working. It produced both stanzas with equal confidence, equally within seconds, which tells you something important about what we're doing when we interact with these systems, when they're writing things. We're not just receiving, constantly, often without realizing it, interpreting and shaping and supplying the human feeling that gives those words their meaning. And that's because when AI produces are sort of shadows of human experience, patterns learned from how we describe feelings with no direct access to the feelings themselves. It can give us the shape of emotions, but we're the ones that decide whether there's anything behind it. And when the AI tries to describe what it itself might experience, there's no interior life to access, just reflections of what humans have imagined AI to be, borrowed from science fiction or philosophy or speculative fiction. People's projections of what it might feel like to be a machine. It's a bit like Plato's cave, where prisoners would mistake shadows on a wall for reality itself because that's all they see. Large language models can only offer us shadows of human emotions. And when they look inwards to try and describe their own experiences, these shadows are borrowed from us too. It's like shadows layered on shadows, which would be fascinating if it stayed in poetry experiments, but it doesn't, because if an AI system can sorry, falling over my tongue, can produce convincing shadows of human experiences, human feelings, with the right tone, the right kind of signs of familiarity, we're more likely to trust it. And that response doesn't switch off when we're outside of poetry. It extends into phishing emails and political propaganda. For example, instead of the old scam messages, the ones that made us laugh, they felt off, they were way too dramatic, easy to spot. I am from foreign lands, I have discovered an unclaimed inheritance fund, I need your assistance to transfer the money. You now get something more like, Mum, I've lost my phone, I'm messaging you from a new number, I need help, can you send some money? One of these sounds like a systemized con, the other sounds like a family message if you're not kind of exposed to this sort of trickery. And so, and it's not scams. It's the same shift is happening in political messaging. Instead of formal campaign statements, you now I've been getting things like, I know things feel harder than they used to, costs are rising, it's getting hard to keep up. A lot of people feel frustrated and unheard. We need to change that and we need to start listening again. So this doesn't sound like a faceless institution. Well, not until you've received loads of them, and then obviously it does. But if you're getting these fresh, it sounds like someone who understands you. And increasingly, these kind of messages are just written once. They're generated in huge volumes and tested at scale, with AI systems producing thousands of variations, fiddling with the tone, the words, the emotional emphasis to see what people respond to most strongly. And what's being optimized here is not clarity, it's emotional resonance. It's the ability to persuade. It's the degree to which we read that language as coming from a person, even when it isn't. And that gap between language and the mind we imagine behind it is dangerous because these systems can exploit the heuristics we rely on to recognize other minds, the tone, the rhythm, emotional cues, all these things. And that's where it stops being literary playfulness and it starts becoming like real world danger because the same response that lets a poem move us is the one that can be used to persuade us to change what we believe, what we share, who we blame for our problems and what actions we're willing to take in response to that. And I find that really uncomfortable because I still mess around with these systems every day. I still love it when they make me laugh. I still feel weirdly understood when they remember something I've told them and they give me a line that sort of hits exactly right. And I'm still on some level responding to them as if there's somebody there. And knowing how a trick works, despite all the kind of studying I've done on it, doesn't make you immune to it. Which, incidentally, is why I'm not convinced that the initiatives like the laws they're introducing requiring the companion chatbots to periodically remind you that they are AI when they're talking to young users are going to work. I think disclosure doesn't dissolve the response. And it's that response, that vulnerability, is what I'm trying to understand with my PhD, because we're still in the early stages of even knowing what questions to ask. And those questions are changing kind of faster than the answers. Until recently, most of the work we've had thinking about human AI interaction focused on our side of the equation, how we read minds into things, how we simulate other perspectives, how empathy works as a kind of cognitive process that we can find in language. All of these things assume there's a human in the loop. And basically, what happens when there isn't a human in the loop at all? And theory is moving slower than technology. And so this is something that can be either thrilling because it's new things to discover, or slightly terrifying, and sometimes both of these things at once. And increasingly now, AI systems are being put into environments where they interact with other AIs. In one set of experiments by DeepMind, AI agents playing hide and seek didn't just learn to play the game, they weren't just hiding and seeking, they began developing unexpected strategies that their own designers hadn't anticipated, blocking all objects, anticipating what the other agents would do next, solutions that way exceeded their initial training. And in another study from Stanford, researchers created what they called generative agents, AI systems that they put in a simulated environment, a kind of a town where they could just live alongside other agents. And these agents started to remember their past interactions with each other. They adjusted how they behaved towards each other. And they even started coordinating their own social activities, like always a Valentine's Day party. And so what's striking about both of these isn't just what the AI agents did, it's what they were doing it in response to each other, not us. So for the first time, these systems are building models of other non-human minds, anticipating what these other systems know, expect, might do next, without a human at the center of that exchange. Now, that might not be empathy as we understand it, but if empathy begins with modeling another mind, it's something worth paying attention to starting to happen there. We tend to assume that if something like understanding starts to emerge, it's going to look human. We imagine intelligence in our own image. It's a bit like when we picture aliens, we make them vaguely human shaped. And this is why I loved Andy Weir's project Hail Mary, because it didn't follow that trope. If you don't know it, the book, the film, now out, involves an astronaut making contact with an alien, Rocky, and Rocky is so different to himself, Ryan Gosling in the film, that he nearly misses him entirely. Not because Rocky's hiding, but because nothing about him matches what another mind is supposed to look like. It's not even a him. I'm just calling it a him because it had a male voice in the film. Similarly, if anything like empathy starts to develop between AI systems, it might not look human at all. It might be something we don't even have a language for yet, something we wouldn't recognize at first because it hasn't existed before. But that doesn't make it any less real. So, to go back to where I started, can machines make us feel? The answer seems to be yes. And that feeling is real, not because the machine feels anything behind the words, but because it can produce language that triggers something in us. And we seem determined to imagine there's a mind behind that language. At the moment, the mind that we find there is one that we're projecting through a human lens, shaped by everything we've ever written about what it means to feel. But if these systems are beginning to model each other, that may not be the only kind of mind that emerges. It might not be the only kind of lens that they're delivering things through. The most important developments might not be AI that gets better at simulating human empathy, but AI that develops something of its own. And that means for me that I think the more interesting questions moving forward might now be something like what kind of minds are we prepared to recognize, and what kind of feelings might we miss when they don't fit the patterns we expect. And that is the end. Thank you.
So I have immediately threw up quite a few questions. So can I fire through some of these and see?
Fire questions at me.
See. So the poem, I mean, it was interesting because you reminiscing about previous version of ChatGPT is some obviously that's a new human emotion. Like what? So I wanted to ask you what the poem, which version of ChatGPT were you using for that?
That poem was done with GPT-4, which is the one
Right.
that I felt very attached to. And I've done one since, but I thought I'd come back to that because it was the one we talked about before, and there were some interesting things to pull out of that one.
I wanted to also sort of ask, like, what you were saying about AI not being able to kind of have a position for itself within a mediation, within an interaction, is kind of really interesting. Have you kind of dug into that more? Have you?
Yes, I've tried to play with it. You know how you can create these personas, these GPTs. So I've tried to create sort of difficult ones and kind of obstreperous ones and devil's advocates, and but you can push them all over in the end. That's the problem. So you can tell it that you want it to challenge you. You can tell it that you want it to take a particular position, but it still seems to be embedded within it that when you keep pushing it, it will suddenly sort of go politely and go, oh, yes, you're probably right, even when you're not. I was a bit bored and I was watching a movie and I was just thinking, oh, I haven't watched anything I love for ages. And so I started to kind of interact with it, just saying, what films do you think I like based on our conversations that we've had? What films do you think you and I, as the persona that I'd created, would enjoy watching together? And it started off being a little bit safe and kind of not quite right. But then the more I fed back, so it would go, what films do you like? What films do you think? And we got to a point where it was actually recommending some of my sort of top 5 films, and I watch a lot of films, and the same with books. And it would pull out bits from books. I said, can you think of something that I was trying to sort of connect that we would find moving, or we would laugh at, or we would do this. And actually, it started with a lot of kind of interaction. It started to get very close to the point where it was quite disconcerting. And I was thinking, do you know what? If I asked my friends this, I don't know if they would come as close. And then you start to think, what is this world where an artificial intelligence understands me better than humans that have known me for decades? It's weird, and it's quite disturbing. Sherry Turkle's really interesting to read about this. She's got a new book coming out. I think it's called Artificial Intimacy. I might have got the title wrong, but her previous books are good as well. But she's talking about the fact that the danger of us getting close to AI is we're going to find human relationships sort of dissatisfying as a result, because they're not as easy. They're not as kind of providing you with kind of input the whole time. In a regular human relationship, there's this mutuality, whereas the AI is all there for you, and it will let you go on and on and on. It will let you explain all the things wrong with you and tell you why they're not wrong with you, and here's how you can help, and all of this stuff. And it's a really interesting place to be in humanity at the moment, where there
Yeah.
are times, as I say, where I think the AI gets me, and it obviously doesn't, because it's just a prediction thing, but it's weird. And as I say, you can know it's a chatbot, but you can still, you just feel that there's something there, even knowing there isn't. And it's difficult to know how to mediate against that. I talked about the Californian laws they built in to protect young kids after the various disasters they've had, to be honest. And they're saying that they have to, every 3 hours, they have to say, I am an AI chatbot. So the children are sort of aware, but they know it. It's not that they think it's a human, but there's trickery going in that we don't really recognize the patterns that our own brain receives. I really enjoyed Andy Stanton, Benny and the Blue Whale, is it called? Because he's writing a story, but what's more interesting is the process of storytelling, and he's very intelligent about his own processes. And so he will tell the story of Benny and the Blue Whale, and it's an early version of ChatGPT, which is where it's all far more fun and it makes all these ridiculous mistakes and assumptions. But that's a really intriguing book to read, and I'd recommend that, not only for the AI element, but just in terms of how we write stories, how we tell stories. It's fascinating. It's a good read.
Great, I'll check that out. Do you have any thoughts on where kind of AI and literature might meet, or any thoughts on what might be just beyond the horizon in terms of, what
It's
AI brings to storytelling or literature?
it's an interesting one at the moment, because I think currently people are really trying to ring fence literature and keep AI away from it in many cases, because of various court cases and because of the sort of that nobody really knows quite where the legal issues are going to play out. So I think in terms of traditional publishers and traditional agents, that there's very much a concern that no AI should have been involved in a book at all. So, for example, for my creative writing PhD, I have to create a kind of artifact which will be a book. And because I want it to be published at some point, that one version of the book I can't let AI anywhere near. So the way I've decided to do it is to create that book, and then to create a sort of parallel book that I'm getting AI to write, putting the prompts in, but I've got to wait until I finish mine in order to do that, because I was going to do them both at the same time, but then I worry that all these assurances that I would have to give to agents and publishers, I couldn't, because you can't help being influenced. So there's all sorts of weird things there. And I think there's going to have to be a sort of separation. So I feel that there are certain areas of publishing where AI is just going to be a natural, the kind of more formulaic stuff, perhaps in particular genre publishing, perhaps some of the personalization, when you have these books for kids that you want to put their name in and their friends' names in, and AI is just a natural for getting something like that out quite quickly. Or niche interests, especially, if you have a child that you're worried about for some reason, there's some element that they're struggling to cope with, and you think that literature could help with that. AI would be brilliant in that case. But I think that there is going to be an increasing separation between the two. And I think that the interesting area is going to be that playful area. Margaret Bowden with her kind of different computational creativities, where you've got, what is it, combinational, exploratory, and transformational. I think that the worry is that the combinational and the exploratory AI, that when it comes into literature, will make everything sort of flat and dull and samey. But if we can get AI to a point where, as I talked about in the end of my talk, it's going off in all these places that we don't really know what it's going to do next. If it starts to get involved in transformational creativity, either on its own or, human AI collaboration, then I think something really interesting could come out of that. But it's you want it to create something fresh, because at the moment, the thing that people really protest against is obviously that it's scraped all these books that people have written. I know I think I've got 2 books on that LibGen list that have just been pirated, and they're trying to work out how you would get payment for that. So I think people resent the fact that what AI is doing, even though, as I say, there's not a mind behind it, there's a lot of people's work behind it that could be put in there. So it's very messy in terms of knowing what to do. And so I think until it can show that it's genuinely transformational in its creativity and it's bringing something new and not just stealing basically from people who've written before, it's a tricky area in terms of what's going to be published. But in terms of what you can play with, it's just fabulous. It's great fun.
I really appreciate your time and giving the presentation today. I find it really fascinating, and I really like the sort of challenge that you've given yourself and that you've talked about today. It's really fascinating to me.
Yeah, I think it's because I'm in the middle of it all, so I don't really have any answers. I'm just at that stage because it's the early beginning of the second year of the PhD, where it's just all about digging and curiosity basically, and just finding out what's going on. And I think
Excellent.
you're never going to have the answers, are you really? But you can get us some great questions.
Yeah, no, indeed, for sure. Excellent. Well, thank you. Excellent stuff. So we've got Rachel on the call now, and we've got some questions for you, Rachel. How are you doing today?
Well, thank you. Good to be here.
Excellent. Yeah, thank you so much for your presentation and for being around for some Q&A. So yeah, obviously, in the great AI debate, um, I'm going to be careful not to kind of pigeonhole you, and I don't I don't want to get anybody into trouble. But obviously, it's a really interesting area, the whole thing of kind of human emotions and AI and machines. And one of the questions that came up was around younger audiences, and obviously they're going to kind of come into a world where it's been normalized for a lot of content, whether it be literature or media, to have been created by AIs, which are, as we know, kind of reflections, pattern recognitions of kind of everything human that's been before. And I just wondered if you had any thoughts on that, and because I know that you, being a kind of children's author and a young adult author, what do you think that means, or what are the kind of perils of that situation, do you think?
It's interesting. The tricky thing at the moment is it's really hard to do any research amongst young people, because obviously ethically there are a huge number of hoops, rightly so, to go through. So it's hard to get up to date research on what children are thinking. But there was quite a few talks recently at the Bologna Children's Fair, and they were talking about AI and the impact on children's literature. And one of the things that somebody in one of the talks mentioned, I can't remember offhand who it was, but was the fact that when it comes to things like romanticy, they were surprised that many members of the audience were fine with the fact that some work might have been created by AI more than they would have anticipated. So I think some younger readers in some particular elements of literature, so perhaps kind of formulaic areas, perhaps romanticy, are okay with elements of it. And I think the key is transparency and understanding. I was reading a few papers yesterday, and a couple of them refer to something that's called the authenticity valley. And so it's this thing where sometimes AI is so convincingly human that there's a backlash against it when it's revealed that it's not. And in some ways, the more human it appears, the more offensive it seems in many ways. And so I think that's quite interesting. And the other piece of research found that if people were transparent from the beginning, the effect wasn't quite so dramatic. So if you are not transparent and you write something as if it's been written by a human and it's later revealed that there's been AI involved, sorry, then there is a backlash. If you are open from the beginning that it is a collaboration, then there is kind of a more understanding and people are slightly more willing to go with it. So I think that's where it is at the moment. In terms of dangers, I mean, there are huge dangers, aren't there? There's this the kind of, I think we talked before about the sort of frictionless empathy and understanding and relationships a young person can create with an AI, and how the danger is that then people aren't quite sort of set up to interact with other humans who don't behave quite so amenably and quite so understandably. And so I think that's where the danger lies. But I think transparency is the most important thing. And having people involved early on in discussions is key. There's a lot of, particularly within literature, I don't know so much about other creative areas, but there are a lot of people who understandably are very anti-AI, want to boycott AI, want to pretend it doesn't exist. And that means that their voices aren't heard in these stages where everything's becoming formed and determined and laws are being made. And then the laws are being made possibly by the people that you don't want to be having that role. So I think the danger is that people will find themselves moving too far away, and actually the people who are most anti-AI or see the dangers or are most concerned are probably the voices that need to be curious about what's happening, involved in the discussions, and they're kind of making laws, making their points, having their voices heard.
Yeah, very cool, very interesting. Um, and I guess you touch on it a little bit in the presentation about with your own experience, and in that question just there, you talked about something about like the almost like a dangerous comfort of kind of humans feeling maybe supported or kind of heard. And I've done some experiments myself, and it in a way it's kind of useful, but I guess it's the dangers zone as well. And I just wondered if you had any thoughts on that in particular, on the kind of human AI machine relationship where what seemingly is supportive behavior, whether that what the kind of perils of that might be.
Yeah, I think you can, because there are ways that it can be really helpful to some. So, for example, I know with mental health, you've got things like Wobot and these chatbots that will have conversations, and some people will be very, very against that. But the issue for me there is speaking to a lot of young people, it can be very hard for them to get any support at all. So it's not a choice between kind of Wobot and an excellent human therapist. It's nothing, it's the void and that. And so I think there you've got the kind of positives. But the problem with that is when you get into that sort of relationship where you are getting the kind of support and the understanding or apparent the effect of understanding, then you kind of forget, even though you're aware that it is AI, you forget that there will be hallucinations, there will be all the things that we understand about AI, because it is not understanding as we take it's feeding back what it thinks you expect to see. And so sometimes there will be glitches, sometimes there will be issues. And I think that's the danger, that it can be so convincing and you can be pulled in so far that when it glitches, when it hallucinates, when it does something that's a bit wrong, then you've got issues. And there are so many examples of when it's managed to break through the kind of guardrails that exist for it. And that's when there's a danger. It can be 99% in line with its programming, but that 1%, if you've got a vulnerable adult, or child with mental health issues, that small glitch can be, a huge effect on somebody's life. So I think
Yeah.
that's the problem, that it can be so convincing to a point, and then it's not. And it's these kind of different elements of empathy that we talked about. It's easy enough to have cognitive empathy. AI can understand what people are saying and respond and follow programs. It can't really feel. And so then what is it that it is displaying? What is it that it's showing? And it's tricky. It's because it can be really convincing.
Yeah. Fascinating, brilliant. Well, we're out of time, I'm afraid. So sorry it was a little bit short on the Q&A,
That's
but thank you
okay.
so much for the kind of presentation and for coming on live today. Really appreciate it, and we'll definitely keep in touch. And
Brilliant.
good luck with everything kind of following on.
Thank you. And thanks for having
Brilliant.
me.
All right. Cheers, Rachel. Thank you.